Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture of literature. I'm Adrian Fort, and we are here for another short story discussion. The short story discussion playlist here on the channel is growing ever so quickly, but there's also a short story review playlist here on the channel. But today's short story discussion comes to us from the Oxford Book of American Short Stories. It comes to us, which was compiled, by the way, by the timeless Joyce Carol Oates. The short story in question is Red-Headed Baby. The author of this is Langston Hughes, the incomparable Langston Hughes. One of at least three authors in here, along with Kate Chopin and Kate Chopin, and Samuel Clemens, for some reason listed as Samuel Clemens instead of Mark Twain, who were good Missouri people. But Red-Headed Baby, what is this short story about, and why are we talking about it today? Red-Headed Baby is the story of Clarence, Mr. Clarence, not just Clarence, Mr. Clarence, that comes into play later, is a sailor. And as sailors are wont to do, he has ported up in a Florida town, and in this Florida town, there happens to be a missus that he will visit, but not a missus, a miss, but not a miss at all. Just a girl who maybe sells her body. Hard to say, really, because Clarence doesn't know that for sure. He just knows for sure that she has been with him. She is mixed. So her mother is a black woman. She is what is referred to in this story as yellow-skinned. And that is an older term. We don't really use that term anymore for people who are half black, half white. But it was at one point mentioned. The sort of racist way to speak about someone who was mixed was to say that they were yellow-skinned. Upon visiting said family, Betsy is the girl's name. She's no longer a girl. She's a young woman. She's 20. And her mother. It comes about that though they did not use to drink, now they keep a little liquor in the house. L-I-C-K-E-R, liquor in the house. But they used to be church-going folk, didn't they? And that's okay, because Betsy's still there, and she wants to flirt with Clarence, Mr. Clarence. She wants to spend some time with Mr. Clarence. And her mother was all too quick to wrangle her up at the behest of Mr. Clarence. And while Mr. Clarence is poking and prodding on Betsy, and maybe downing a little bit of liquor, there's some movement across the way. And a door opens, and a child comes out of that door. Now, Mr. Clarence hasn't been here in 3 years, so he is out of sorts with the goings-on in this house. He doesn't know that Betsy has a child, but he's none too appreciative of the child being around when he, Mr. Clarence, is attempting to get a bit frisky with Betsy. So Betsy's mother tries to get the child away, shoo the child back into the kitchen, the room. Betsy says no. Betsy says no, leave my child alone, let him stay. And while he's rummaging around on the floor, he gets a little too close to Mr. Clarence. And Mr. Clarence notices this boy has red hair. Kind of weird. Calls him a yellow-skinned boy with red hair. Well, Clarence has red hair. And at that moment, he jolts into action and decides to leave because he hasn't been there in 3 years, and that child is almost 2.5 and has red hair. And they keep calling the child Clarence, him Mr. Clarence, but the child, Clarence. It seems he's that baby's daddy. So he leaves. Now, I'm not going to belabor the plot. I'm not going to belabor the obvious racial overtones and undertones to this story. I'm not going to simply pass over the, if you will, metaphorical substrate of this short story. But I don't think that's what I want to talk about in its entirety. So what we have here, we're gonna talk about that part. We're gonna get it on the table. But what I think is the most interesting thing about this story is something that is not ever clearly delineated. So the very opening of this story, I think it's 2 or 3 sentences. 2 sentences here. 3 sentences. Dead. Dead as hell. These little burgs on the Florida coast, a lot of half-built skeleton houses left over from the boom. Never finished. Never will be finished. So we've got Mr. Clarence walking around the neighborhood trying to find Betsy's house. And I'm going to read this again, just to let it marinate a little bit. Dead. Dead as hell. These little burgs on the Florida coast, a lot of half-built skeleton houses left over from the boom. Never finished, never will be finished. So what we have literally going on here is a boom, right? Mentioned the boom. A boom is an economic windfall. An economic windfall which is normally about a natural resource being discovered and then exploited. That is what most booms were. Most boom towns were towns erected around some natural resource, which was then extracted, and then the town was abandoned. The boom is the economic windfall. Carelessness and abandonment after said boom led to homes being broken. Okay, that's what's literally going on here. An economic windfall. After the economic windfall, there's carelessness and abandonment. When the good stuff is gone, the natural resource is gone, and that leads to homes being broken. All these homes he's passing by on the street are never finished, never will be finished. So, what we're looking at when we're talking about the sort of metaphorical substrate, to Betsy and her mother, the economic windfall was a white man coming to the house. The economic windfall of the white man coming around in order to get the goods, in order to extract the natural resources. And after the good stuff was gone, after the sex was had, the white man leaves. The sex was taken and he goes. The home being broken is obvious. That there's a family without a father figure. That's referred to as a broken home in colloquial terms. That is sort of the metaphorical stuff going on here. You have layered on top of that all of this stuff with booms are created in desolate areas. White people come in and rape the land, right? You have a white person coming in by sea, no less, taking natural resources, raping the land, raping the natural resources. Those are the racial themes dolloped on top of the metaphorical substrate, which gives you multiple things going on top of that. You have Betsy's mother, who is, we are led to believe, completely black. That sounds weirder than I was hoping, but whose mother and father, we are presuming, were both black, because she mentions how Betsy's father was white, So this is generational. There is generational there are generational likenesses going on here. Betsy has given birth to a son from a white man the same way that her mother did. Betsy's father is not around in the same way that Mr. Clarence is not around. And the story reads, when you pick it up and you read it through, the story reads as sort of like a joke, really. There is a setup, there is a delivery, and a punchline, right? Mr. Clarence is sitting around this table, and he notices this child, who both Betsy and her mother both keep referring to as Clarence. Well, that's my name. And he's got red hair, the same as I've got red hair. And he yells, "Christ! Christ!" And then he gets up and he goes. So it is delivered very much like a joke. It's delivered very much like a skit. The weird thing about that is that we don't normally think of Langston Hughes as sort of a punchy writer. We don't normally think of Langston Hughes as someone who delivers the boom of his stories or his novels or his poetry with so much of a chuckle. But it is sort of chuckle-inducing. And I think it's only really chuckle-inducing when you accept the story in the way that the story was written. The story was written through the eyes of Mr. Clarence. The story was written with the acceptance that the only person whose voice really matters is the white man. That's the way this story is written. That's the way, if you accept the storytelling as sort of the universal truth to the world in which the story happens, it is delivered that way. You know Mr. Clarence isn't coming back. You know that the stupidity with which Mr. Clarence deigned to paint the entire world of the black folk in this story was the same type of stupidity that Mr. Clarence carried around with him. That was the great irony of this story, was that Mr. Clarence walked around trying to talk about how stupid these black folks were and they were never going to fix up their houses, etc., etc. He was sitting in a room with a child about 2.5 years old when he hadn't seen this woman for 3 years. The child was named Clarence, same name as his. The child had red hair, same color as his. And he didn't realize the child was his. He was an idiot, right? That is from whence the irony of this story springs. And that's what makes it feel like a joke. Punchy, like a joke. And if you accept the narrative as it is told, it's going to come across that way. But I want to read a couple different quotes from this story to you. In this book, on page 362, we get this little exchange. Mr. Clarence is trying to butter up Betsy. And while he's telling her she looks good, you using rouge too, ain't you? And she replies, "Sweet rouge. Y'all?" he says. "Yeah, man. Sweet and red like your hair," she says. "Y'all?" he says. Sweet and red like your hair. The rouge that she's using sweet and red like your hair. She wanted to remember his hair. On the kissing page to that, page 363 in this collection, the boy has entered the room, and Mr. Clarence is screaming about the boy. Get him out of here. What are you doing? What is he doing? Get him out of here. Betsy's mother says, Betsy's mother basically is screaming at the child that she's going to beat him if he doesn't leave. To which Betsy replies, "Ma, let him stay." I think in this story, Betsy was not playing the part of the victim, because I think in this story, Betsy has a clear indication in her life, the fact that her father is not there, that Mr. Clarence will not be there. When he returns, I think she is emotionally invested in him staying. She wants him to stay. She's trying to win him. She has made herself up with rouge that is just as sweet and red as his hair. She makes sure to compliment him on the hair that their son has atop his head. Hair that is the same color with which she adorns her cheeks. When Clarence, the child, enters the room, Betsy wants him to stay. Betsy wants, if nothing else, just these few moments to have a family. She doesn't get them. Mr. Clarence flips absolute shit. Flip shit. Abandons the place. Obviously, I mean, we had that foreshadowed at the beginning. Houses that are never fixed and never will be fixed. Never finished. Never will be finished. Betsy has herself an incomplete family. And I think she was hoping to have a complete family. I think that here she was, being brave enough to get her heart broken. That's what we have happening. We have Mr. Clarence running out on them a final time. So we could forgive Mr. Clarence for having left after the initial sex. He didn't know she was pregnant. He didn't know that. And here he is 3 years later coming back. It seems to me Betsy is invested in Mr. Clarence staying and taking part in her child's life. She defends her. So the child is also, I think, the child is described as deaf. The child is described as having no emotional connection to physical threats. I think this child is autistic. I don't think that this child is deaf. I think this child is non-reactionary. They mentioned that the child is 2.5 and not talking. Maybe I'm just making too many connections here. But I think that the child, when these tirades are going off against the child, Betsy is quick to defend her son. She is especially quick to defend her son when Mr. Clarence, the child's father, is present. And I think This is not a comedy, though it is delivered as a joke, with a punchline. I think this is tragedy. I think this is a story of heartbreak. And that is all I have for this short story discussion over Red-Headed Baby by Langston Hughes. If you like this sort of thing, it really helps me out here on the channel if you hit that like button. If you do enjoy this sort of thing, make sure you're subscribed. And there's, as always, a playlist for short story discussions, as well as short story reviews, as well as poetry discussions, poetry reviews, all sorts of playlists here on the channel. Make sure you check out that tab here on the channel. And I hope to see you back next time for another piece of literature.